1,000 years ago, if you had followed a thin trail of smoke across a Scandinavian valley and pushed open a heavy wooden door, you would not have stepped into the kind of Viking hut modern imagination loves to picture. You would have entered a longhouse, low, broad, and deliberately built to endure a world where winter was not a season, but a force that shaped every decision. From the outside, it could seem plain, even severe. Yet the first truth of Viking domestic life is that their homes were not crude shelters thrown together by brute strength. They were intelligent answers to cold, wind, scarcity, and community, designed to keep bodies alive and a household functioning when daylight was short and storms could erase a week's work overnight. The longhouse was the center of a family's economy, its safety, and its identity. It held food, tools, stories, and authority under the same roof. And it did so in a way that feels unfamiliar to us precisely because it was so practical. There were no modern rooms to retreat into, no private corners built for the individual, because the house itself was built around the group, the family, the kin, the workers, sometimes the animals that meant the difference between surviving and failing. In this single structure, daily life and social order intertwined, where you sat, where you slept, what you could touch, and when you were allowed to speak were all quietly shaped by the space around you. And at the heart of that space was not furniture or decoration, but something far older and more powerful: fire. In the Viking world, the home was not defined by walls alone, but by the warmth that gathered people together, the light that pushed back the dark, and the smoke that rose toward a roof built to hold against the north. To understand Viking houses is to understand how Viking life was organized from the inside out, starting with the longhouse as a whole, then moving toward the living core where heat, food, and stories were made, and from there outward to the materials and design that turned a harsh landscape into a place a family could call home. In the center of a Viking longhouse, the most important room was not separated by walls or marked by doors, because it was not a room at all, but a living axis around which everything turned: the hearth. It lay along the middle of the packed earth floor like a calm, controlled wound of light, fed with wood and tended with care, never treated as a casual convenience. In a land where cold could numb fingers within minutes and darkness could swallow the day before work was finished, fire was not merely warmth, it was time itself, measured in the steady labor of gathering fuel, splitting logs, and keeping embers alive through the long stretches of night. A household that failed to manage its fire did not simply lose comfort. It risked losing food, losing strength, losing the ability to endure the next storm. Around this central flame, the daily rhythm formed naturally, because everything that mattered depended on it: cooking, drying, mending, curing, and the slow, patient work of turning raw materials into what a family needed to survive. The air above the hearth carried a constant haze because smoke was the price of heat in a world without chimneys in the modern sense. It drifted upward, searching for gaps in the roof, slipping through openings under thatch or through louvered vents when they existed, sometimes pooling in the rafters like a low ceiling of gray. To modern lungs it would feel harsh and intrusive, yet the Vikings lived with it as an expected companion. And in that companionship there was an unexpected advantage. Smoke helped preserve what was precious, especially food. Meat and fish hung above the fire to dry and cure, absorbing both warmth and protection, because the same smoke that stung the eyes also discouraged insects and slowed decay. In the longhouse, preservation was not an isolated task carried out in a separate pantry. It was integrated into the home's breathing, into the ordinary act of keeping a flame alive. The scent of smoke became part of the household's identity, woven into clothing, hair, wooden tools, and woolen blankets, until the people themselves carried the atmosphere of their home wherever they walked. Light, too, came from the same source, though it was never abundant. The hearth's glow did not flood the longhouse like daylight. It formed a moving circle of visibility, a soft, shifting boundary that defined what could be done and what had to wait. On winter afternoons, when the sun sank early behind ridges and trees, that glow decided whether hands would keep working or retreat into stillness. It touched the edges of benches and posts, caught the curve of a carved bowl, flashed on a blade as it was cleaned, and then faded again into shadow. The longhouse was not built for brightness. It was built for steadiness, for the kind of endurance that does not waste resources. Torches were costly. Oil for lamps was not always easy to spare. So the hearth remained the reliable center, and the household arranged itself accordingly, drawn inward by warmth and light, the way a ship's crew gathers around a single lantern at sea. Within that circle, cooking was both ordinary and demanding. Pots of iron or soapstone could hang from chains or rest on stones, and the simplest meals, porridge, stews, bread baked on heated surfaces, were the foundation of survival. The food itself was shaped by climate and economy: grains when harvests allowed, dairy when animals were healthy, dried fish where coasts provided it, and meat when a slaughter could be afforded. Yet beyond the ingredients, it was the method that mattered, because cooking in a longhouse meant managing heat without modern control. Flames rose, fell, and shifted with drafts. Embers had to be coaxed into the right intensity, smoke had to be endured, and timing became a skill taught by repetition, not by written instructions. The hearth demanded attention, but it also rewarded it, providing not only meals, but the warmth that relaxed stiff muscles, and the small comfort that made harsh days bearable. The hearth also shaped behavior in a way that architecture alone could not. People gravitated toward it, not only for heat, but for social gravity, because warmth creates a hierarchy as surely as power does. The best places were closer to the fire and less exposed to drafts. The least desirable were near doorways or where wind found its way inside. Seating along the sides, often benches that could serve as beds at night, turned the longhouse into a shared chamber where bodies and routines overlapped. Here, conversation did not float casually as it might in a modern living room. It carried weight because everyone heard it, and because darkness pressed the group together. Children learned the unspoken rules of movement and silence not from signs on walls, but from the consequences of stepping too close to the fire, interrupting an elder, or getting in the way of work. Even the simplest tasks, stirring a pot, feeding embers, pulling a hanging fish down to check its dryness, were woven into a web of shared awareness. In that same firelit space, craft and maintenance blended into daily life. Wool could be spun and woven while the hearth warmed hands that would otherwise stiffen. Leather could be softened and repaired. Fishing lines could be mended. Wooden handles could be carved and smoothed. A longhouse was not a place where home life was separate from labor, because survival did not permit that division. Every object was used hard, and every object, sooner or later, needed repair. The hearth made such work possible in winter, when daylight was brief and outdoor tasks were limited. It turned the longhouse into a workshop and a refuge at once, a place where the family's continuity was literally manufactured, thread by thread, tool by tool, meal by meal. Yet there was another, quieter function that the hearth performed, one that cannot be measured in heat or smoke. In a society where memory carried history and spoken words carried law, the fire became a stage for storytelling and the exchange of knowledge. The longhouse, dim around the edges and bright at its core, created the ideal setting for voices to hold attention. Sagas, family lineages, lessons about the sea, warnings about feuds, and practical instruction all flowed more naturally when the night closed in and the household gathered in one place. The fire's steady movement lent a kind of rhythm to speech, and the shared listening reinforced belonging. Even when talk was not grand, even when it was simply the recounting of a day's work or the planning of tomorrow's tasks, the act of speaking and being heard within the longhouse strengthened bonds that were necessary for survival. In the North, isolation was dangerous, and the hearth was the opposite of isolation. It was the visible proof that a household was alive, active, and prepared to endure. Smoke, for all its discomfort, also contributed to the longhouse's durability. It dried timbers slowly and helped deter certain pests, and the constant warmth reduced dampness that could rot a structure from within. Over time, the interior wood could darken, absorbing soot until beams and rafters carried the color of countless winters. That darkening was not neglect. It was the evidence of a working home, a house that had been lived in through seasons of hardship. The longhouse did not aim to remain pristine. It aimed to remain standing, and for that it relied on a careful balance between fire and structure, between heat and the materials chosen to contain it. A poorly managed hearth could spark disaster, and the Vikings knew it, which is why the placement of the fire, the arrangement of stones, and the habits of tending embers were not casual traditions but learned safeguards, repeated until they became instinct. The central hearth, then, was not a single feature among many. It was the heart that made every other feature meaningful. Without it, the longhouse would be a cold shell, a wooden shape vulnerable to frost and darkness. With it, the longhouse became a living organism, warming, preserving, illuminating, and gathering human life into a workable order. And because fire demanded containment, because warmth had to be held against the wind and insulated from the biting cold, the question of how Vikings built their walls and roofs becomes unavoidable. In the north, a flame could only save you if your house knew how to defend it. A Viking longhouse did not defeat the cold by pretending it did not exist. It answered it with materials chosen for the world they lived in, and with a kind of quiet engineering that looks simple only when you forget what it had to endure. The skeleton often began with stout timbers, set firmly into the ground or anchored on low stone footings, forming a frame that could carry weight without cracking under wind or snow. Where good forests stood nearby, wood was the obvious strength, flexible, repairable, and strong enough to span long interiors without the need for many internal divisions. But wood alone was not the shield. The true barrier against northern winters was built in layers, combining what the land offered into walls that could hold warmth the way a body holds breath. Along the sides, turf was more than dirt cut from the earth. It was insulation shaped into blocks, stacked and pressed until the wall became thick, dense, and surprisingly resistant to cold. Turf trapped air within its mass, and trapped air is one of nature's best defenses against freezing temperatures. In many longhouses, timber frames and turf walls worked together. Wood gave structure, turf gave thermal protection, and the two formed a partnership between carpentry and landscape. Where turf was scarce or the soil unsuitable, stone could appear, especially as a base layer to lift wood away from damp ground. But even then, the intent stayed the same. Keep moisture out, keep heat in, keep the household from paying the price of a poorly sealed home. A longhouse did not need to look impressive to be effective. It needed to remain dry, stable, and warm enough that bodies did not waste precious energy simply staying alive. The roof completed this defense, rising in a long, gently sloped line that shed rain and snow rather than resisting them. Its beams and rafters carried a covering of thatch, often reeds, straw, or other vegetation, layered thickly so that water ran off instead of seeping through. In some regions, turf could also crown the roof, adding weight and insulation, turning the top of the house into yet another protective layer of earth. That added mass helped in winter, but it also demanded skill, because a heavy roof is only safe if the frame beneath it is sound. This is where the Vikings' practicality reveals itself. The longhouse was built to be maintained, not admired. Thatch could be replaced, turf could be patched, damaged timbers could be swapped out. A house was not a finished monument. It was a living project, expected to be repaired as seasons tested it. Openings were few, because every hole in a wall is an invitation to wind. Windows, as we think of them, were rare. Light and air entered through small gaps, doorways, and controlled vents in the roof. That meant the interior could feel dim even at midday, but the trade was worth it. Warmth was a limited resource, and the longhouse treated it like food, stored carefully, rationed wisely. The doorway itself was often built with thickness and intention, sometimes with a small entry space or a design that reduced direct drafts, because a straight line from outside to hearth would turn wind into a weapon. A well-made longhouse could hold a stable temperature compared to the brutal air outside, not because it was airtight in a modern sense, but because its mass and layers slowed the exchange between warmth and cold. This architecture also carried the mark of social reality. A prosperous household could afford thicker walls, better timber, and tighter joinery. A poorer one might rely on lighter construction, thinner thatch, or timbers that were not ideally seasoned. Those differences mattered. A wall that allowed dampness to creep in would chill the interior, invite rot, and weaken the very bones of the structure. A roof that was not carefully layered would leak during storms, turning the packed floor to mud and forcing constant repair. In a climate where bad weather could arrive suddenly and linger, these were not minor inconveniences. They shaped health, productivity, and the household's ability to store food and maintain strength. The longhouse, in this way, became a visible measure of a family's stability, even when viewed from the outside as nothing more than a low building in the landscape. Inside, the walls were not simply barriers. They were working surfaces. Wooden pegs and beams allowed tools and clothing to be hung, keeping essentials off the ground and closer to warmth. Storage chests could sit along the sides where benches also ran, turning the perimeter of the longhouse into a line of utility. Sitting, sleeping, storing, working, all aligned with the protective boundary. The walls also shaped sound, turning the interior into an acoustic space where voices carried and movement was heard, reinforcing the shared nature of the household. In such a home, privacy was not built by architecture. It was negotiated by habit, respect, and the social order that everyone understood. The strength of wood and turf did more than resist weather. It created an interior world where a single shared space could function without collapsing into chaos. When the walls held steady, the hearth could do its work, food could be preserved, and people could gather without being driven apart by cold drafts and dampness. The house became a controlled environment, carved out of a harsh landscape, a place where the outside world was kept at bay long enough for daily life to happen. And once those walls and roof established that protective shell, the most revealing question is what the Vikings chose to do with the space they had saved, because the longhouse was not divided into modern rooms, yet it held many lives at once, arranged by custom and hierarchy rather than by architecture. Within the longhouse, space was not carved into private chambers, but held open like a single breath, wide enough to contain work, rest, meals, and authority, without needing walls to explain where one life ended and another began. The interior often ran in a long rectangle, the hearth stretching down the center, and along the sides, benches formed the backbone of daily living. By day, these benches were seats, work surfaces, and places to lay out tools. By night, they became beds, softened with wool, hides, or folded textiles that could be gathered and stored when morning returned. Chests sat nearby, heavy and practical, holding clothing, valuables, and what little could not be left exposed to smoke and damp. The longhouse did not ask each person to possess much. It asked the household to share what mattered, and to move with a discipline shaped by necessity. In such a space, even a small disorder could become a real problem, because feet crossed the same paths, hands reached for the same objects, and the margin for waste was thin. Work flowed through the room as naturally as conversation. Spinning and weaving could happen near the warmth. Repairs could be made where light fell best, and food preparation stayed close to the hearth where heat could be managed. Tools were not hidden away. They were part of the visible life of the house, because labor was not something that took place elsewhere and returned in neat results. It happened in the presence of the family, taught by observation, refined by repetition. Children learned not through lectures, but through proximity, watching hands and copying movements, learning when to speak and when to stay quiet, learning what could be touched and what demanded permission. In this way, the longhouse did not merely shelter a family, it trained one, shaping patience, responsibility, and awareness of others as daily skills rather than abstract virtues. The presence of animals sharpened that reality. In colder months or during storms, livestock could be brought under the same roof, placed at one end of the building or separated by low barriers, their bodies adding heat and their value kept close where theft and wolves were less likely to claim them. The sounds and smells would have been constant. Hooves shifting, breath steaming in the dim air, the faint rustle of straw, and the earthy scent of living creatures sharing the same protection. To modern sensibilities, it can seem primitive, yet it was a calculated choice in a northern climate where losing an animal could mean losing milk, meat, hides, and the strength needed for plowing or hauling. The longhouse made room for animals not because Vikings failed to imagine separation, but because they understood survival as a linked chain. The household endured together, or it did not endure at all. That shared endurance did not erase hierarchy. It made it visible in subtler ways. The longhouse had a social map, and people read it instinctively. The most honored places tended to lie away from drafts, nearer to warmth, and in positions where one could see the length of the room. A head of household, a respected elder, or a host might occupy a seat of higher status, not necessarily elevated by architecture, but elevated by custom and the quiet recognition of everyone present. Guests, too, were arranged according to importance, because hospitality was a form of power. Where you were invited to sit, how close you were brought into the circle of warmth, And whether you were served first were not small gestures. They were signals about alliance, respect, and social standing. Even within a single family, status could be understood through access and responsibility. Who controlled stored goods? Who decided when animals were slaughtered? Who spoke first in serious matters? Who distributed tasks when resources were tight? The longhouse did not create hierarchy, but it displayed it, because nothing was hidden behind doors. This becomes even clearer when wealth enters the picture. Two longhouses might look similar from a distance, yet inside, the differences could be felt in the thickness of bedding, the quality of tools, the abundance of stored food, and the number of hands available for labor. A prosperous household might have more textiles, better ironwork, and a steadier supply of fuel, making the interior warmer and the daily routine less strained. A poorer one might ration firewood, stretch food carefully, and repair tools again and again rather than replace them. Yet both operated within the same logic of shared space, because the longhouse format was not only an economic choice, but a cultural one, built for a society where kinship mattered and community labor made survival possible. The room was large enough to hold many lives precisely because those lives were expected to overlap. Even moments that feel personal to us, rest, reflection, grief, joy, were shaped by this openness. Sleep came in proximity, with bodies arranged along the sides, warmth shared, and the night punctuated by small movements, a cough, the settling of an animal, the soft crackle of embers. Privacy, when it existed, was not a physical boundary but an agreement, a respect granted through silence and restraint. That kind of intimacy was not less meaningful for lacking walls. It was simply built differently, more dependent on mutual awareness than on separation. The longhouse in this sense was a training ground for social life, teaching people to live with each other's presence without constant conflict, because harmony was not a luxury, but a requirement. And yet the longhouse was not only about the family within it. Its open interior, its bench-lined sides, its central hearth, and its visible hierarchy all made it suitable for something larger than daily routine: gathering. When a household hosted others, neighbors, allies, travelers, the room became a stage where relationships were formed and tested. The same space that held work and sleep could hold feasts, negotiations, oaths, and decisions that shaped reputation beyond the walls. In a world where honor and loyalty could be as valuable as land, the longhouse was more than a dwelling. It was a social instrument, capable of turning shelter into influence and domestic order into public power. A Viking longhouse could be understood as a home only if one ignored what it was built to do when the household turned outward, because its true meaning reached beyond shelter into reputation, authority, and memory. In a society where leadership was not maintained by distant institutions but by personal bonds, visible generosity, and the ability to gather people under one roof, the longhouse became a statement written in timber and turf. Its length, the strength of its frame, the steadiness of its warmth, and the order of its interior all communicated a single message. This household can endure, and therefore, it can protect, host, and lead. The house was not merely where a family lived, it was where a name was made reliable, where promises were tested in winter, and where loyalty could be reinforced by the simple act of feeding others when resources were scarce. When visitors arrived, the longhouse shifted without changing shape. The benches that served work and sleep became places of ceremony, not in the formal sense of ritual objects and ornate clothing, but in the deeper sense of social performance. A host's power could be measured in how many were welcomed, how well they were fed, and how secure they felt inside those walls while wind and darkness pressed at the door. A feast was never only a meal, it was a declaration of capability. Bowls and horns passed from hand to hand, stories rose with the smoke, and alliances were strengthened by shared warmth. In that firelit chamber, generosity functioned like currency, and the household that could offer it gained influence. Even the simplest details mattered: a steady hearth, ample fuel, food served without hesitation, the confidence of a host who did not fear running out before morning. Such moments built a reputation that traveled farther than any carved ornament. The longhouse also carried the weight of decision-making. Disputes could be settled there, agreements negotiated, and future ventures planned, because the house was one of the few places where people could gather safely and speak at length. In many Norse communities, law and custom were preserved by memory and recitation, and serious matters required witnesses. The longhouse provided space for that, turning domestic architecture into a tool of governance. A household head did not need a throne room. The seat of authority was established through where one sat, who stood nearby, and how others responded. The room itself became an arena where respect was either granted or withheld, and where a leader's credibility could be reinforced through calm order rather than force. A longhouse that held gatherings without chaos demonstrated more than hospitality. It demonstrated control. Identity lived there as well, not as an abstract idea, but as a set of tangible signs. Objects carried stories, a well-made tool inherited from an older generation, a carved piece of wood that marked craftsmanship, a chest that held textiles produced by hands the household trusted. The scent of smoke and clothing was not only practical, it was a signature of home. Even the wear on thresholds and benches recorded a household's life, marking years of movement and seasons survived. In this way, the longhouse became a container of memory, a place where family history was not stored in written records, but embedded in the daily environment. When stories were told beside the hearth, they did not float in empty space. They anchored themselves to the walls that had heard them before, to the beams darkened by countless nights, to the very floor that had been crossed by children who grew into adults and elders. Differences in status sharpened that sense of identity. A chieftain's hall could be larger, built with finer timber, reinforced with better craftsmanship, and capable of hosting more people, turning architecture into a visible extension of political reach. A smaller longhouse, modest but well kept, could still hold dignity, because Norse honor was not only a matter of wealth, but of reliability and courage under pressure. Yet size mattered because it expanded possibility. More space for guests, more storage for surplus, more capacity to survive a poor season without losing standing. The most influential households were those that combined practicality with presence, turning a functional building into a public signal of strength. By the time one understood the longhouse in this way, as a living center of survival, social order, and authority, the image of Viking life shifted from crude simplicity to deliberate design. The longhouse was a technology of community, built to hold heat, hold people, hold resources, and hold a household's name steady against the unpredictability of the North. And when that is seen clearly, the house stops being background scenery and becomes a key to understanding the Vikings themselves. A culture that measured wealth in resilience, status in generosity, and identity in the ability to gather others and endure together.